The gospel lesson this morning is taken from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, and I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, and you may follow along in your pew Bibles as you'd like. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my accuser." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I fear not God, nor have respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says, and will not God grant justice to God's chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, it's just lovely to be with you this morning. What a beautiful neighborhood, what a beautiful sanctuary. I'm about 4 years new to Indiana, coming from North Carolina, and so I hadn't yet made my way into this neighborhood, but I had the great opportunity to meet Maureen through a clergy conference at a small IU Health clinic a couple of miles from here, the Connected Care Clinic. And through that, we got connected a little bit, and just delighted to be with you this morning and to spend some more time this morning with Maureen and learn a little bit about your parish and things here. I understand, for instance, that in a few weeks it's kind of a big day. The trick-or-treat in the rest of the world is its own thing, but here in Irvington, it's a thing? Is that? All right, well, trick-or-treat. I hope to come to your door, maybe. In all seriousness, I would like to bring greetings to you from the Spiritual Care Department of IU Health, which is where, as we said to the kids, I live and work and have my days. Thank you for the welcome. So, this is how the story goes, or at least how the story was told to me. It was Christmas time. I'm like 2.5 years old, and my beloved grandparents, we call them Granny and Papa in the South, brought wonderful new presents. Brought a shiny new bike for my older brother Bill, he was 5, and a shiny new tricycle with the little tassels that came off of it for me. Great gifts, right? Age-appropriate, wonderful gifts. I took the trike and threw it off the porch. It's not fair. Bill gets this wonderful new shiny bike, and I get this little trike. It's not right. Far be it. I couldn't ride the thing, of course. The other thing was too big for me, but it's not fair. Kind of amazing, isn't it, that even before we have actual memories, even when we're just 2.5 years old, the idea that something would not be fair to us, that we would not get our fair portion, just gets all over us. You know, why is that? So actually, this is a little interesting to me, at least. The developmental psychologists who sort of put developmental psychology on the map, Eric and Joan Erickson, does that mean anything to you? Anyway, they called this stage of development, right after infancy and as you develop into a toddler, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy, I'm going to be who I am in the world, I'm going to be strong and powerful, versus, I'm not sure I can pull that off. Doubt, and then shame, and this is really interesting, that we would experience a slight of unfairness, even at that age, as being shameful. Why? Well, because I'm not powerful enough to make my will known. So I'm not powerful enough as a 2.5-year-old to get that bike, and that makes me feel shamed, and so what do? Well, I pitch fit. I'm a little older now and sometimes pitch less fits, but It's true that it's not fair stays with us, right? Only as we grow and as we mature, and as we're confronted, with our own challenges in the world and our own real heartaches. And then when we see what's going on in the world around us, where it seems as though the poor get poorer and the rich do pretty well and buy giant yachts, where there's the threat of war, right, in Europe, and there is the threat of gun violence and poverty so very close to home. It's not fair. My sense, and perhaps you can relate to this, is that as the cruelty of the world becomes more clear, our longing for justice, for some court of appeals to make the crooked straight, our longing for justice grows deeper. It grows so deep that sometimes a counter message comes up that we hear first from others and then in our own brain, which is the opposite, right? Which is, whoever told you the world would be fair? What do you expect anyway? Our gospel passage invites us right into this tension between our heart's longing for justice and the sort of unending litanies of cruelty that we see played out around us in the world today. The gospel passage is called The Widow and the Unjust Judge. And at first reading, it seems to invite us right into the question, in what ways is God like the unjust judge? Let's read the first verses again. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my accuser." Makes me wonder, who is this woman and what is she accused of? Is she in danger? Is she worried for her life? And who is this judge anyway who fears neither God nor his community? Story goes on. For a while the judge refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." Begs the question, is this what it means to pray? That if we persist and persist, the answer we long for comes? Is prayer a sort of long-distance spiritual run? It's a really hard question, isn't it? In my experience, the power of prayer and the opportunity to keep praying and to stay with something does change things, does change me, does give me hope. And also in my experience, and this is sometimes particularly true at the bedside, that the prayers we most long for sometimes don't come true, no matter how we persist, at least the way we hope they may come true. And so sometimes it seems doubtful that persistence alone makes everything work out. The parable continues. And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" So, how are we to make sense of this parable? Well, there are a number of ways. You'll not be surprised to hear this passage, a number of interpretations if we sort of dig into it. And I'm helped by scholars like Marcus Borg, who suggest that our faith is deepened when we don't sort of pit interpretations against one another so much as we let each interpretation inform us. So instead of it being like a little battle of what's right and what's wrong, it's more like a microscope then we could set at different settings to each give us a perspective on the passage. So I read these words from a pastor, David Luce, from Minneapolis, of a Lutheran congregation, who points out that Jesus, in telling us this parable, recognizes that the listener will get it, that it's absurd to ever think that God is like the unjust judge. But it's more like this. If even the most unjust of judges finally relents to the ceaseless petitions of a defenseless widow, how much more will God, who is, after all, a good God, answer our prayers? And this pastor goes on to suggest that this interpretation may be particularly helpful for those of us who are reluctant to go to God in prayer, who are a little ashamed to go to the maker of the universe and say, "Who am I, Lord, to consider me?" And so this passage may be saying, don't be ashamed of who you are. Don't be ashamed of your needs. No, bring all of who you are. Bring your vulnerability. Bring your worries to God. And God, not like this unjust judge, God will hear your prayers. So that's for one setting on the microscope. Another way to read the passage is to pay attention to the context in which it was written. So Luke's gospel writer, the author of Luke and Acts, we think, was writing at a time when the people of the church were annoyed, distressed, worried that the second coming promised by Jesus had not yet happened. Put yourself in the pews of this congregation, if you will, right? Folks in the early church at this period who were marginalized from the greater community, laughed at by the greater community, that they had paid attention to this Jewish rabbi turned revolutionary, turned prophet, right? Who told them that the second coming would be there. And so here, if you're listening in that context and you hear this parable, you hear, don't worry. Just like this woman who has been ashamed, like you're ashamed, but she keeps coming, your persistence will pay off. And there's yet one more way to hear this passage, reading, microscope lens, that I'd invite us to think about this morning, that I heard about from a guy named Dr. David Galler, who teaches religion at Emory. Like all good stories, the way you hear a story depends on who you identify with. So in this parable, do you identify with the unjust judge? Do you identify with the widow? Do you identify with maybe those in the room who are hearing this go on? So Galler's imagination and says, imagine that you're one of those people in the room listening to this go on with the judge and the widow. And how does that go? So Galler has in the piece I read, has a portrait, a famous portrait that was done 100 or so years ago by John Everett Millay of this parable. And in the portrait, the judge is depicted as dismissive and aloof. He's looking off, and he's got jewels all over his hands, and he's looking away from the widow like so. The widow is depicted as stalwart but vulnerable, beseeching the court. And so she's sort of like this in a posture of, hear me. Those in the courtroom, there's the one who clearly serves the judge, whose eyes are fixed on the judge and ignoring the widow. There are those who are clearly laughing at the widow, clearly sort of in a cruel way, just laughing at her. And then there are those who don't seem bothered at all, one way or the other. But there's some. There's some in the portrait who clearly stand with the widow, who clearly are moved by her plight and say, my place is with you. Those who stand with a widow know that to be a widow in ancient times is to have neither standing nor power in the world, completely sort of powerless. And so even though the Jewish law says that the judge is supposed to favor the widow and the orphan, those in the know that in the Holy Roman Empire, that doesn't count. So the judge, co-opted in this way, ignores the Jewish law, and here's this powerless woman. It is not fair. And when it's not fair, the question for us, a question for a follower of Jesus, may be, where do we stand? With whom do we stand? Like the cynic who believes nothing can change? And before we run right by that one, I don't know, I'll just say for me, sometimes that's where I find myself standing. I'll just be confessional. Sometimes it's like, this is a cruel, hard world. I don't know what I can do about it. Do we stand like the judge's servant and just sort of say, my eye is on the boss? What the boss says, that's good for me. Do we stand like those who avert their eyes and just hope it'll go all away? Or do we sometimes stand with the widow? Do we stand like the civil rights leader John Lewis, who apparently told his mom, Mom, I know I'm not supposed to get in trouble, but sometimes, just sometimes, I'm called to get into good trouble. Galler makes one other point I would bring to our attention. I think this is interesting. The key verse reads, "Yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so she will not wear me out by continually coming." In this verse, the phrase that reads, "wear me out," can be translated, "she gave me a black eye." She gave me a black eye. Talk about good trouble. The widow sort of turned the tables. She took what society said might have been her shame, and by her steadfast appeal to the judge and by refusing to take the low road of incivility or of violence, she gave the judge the bruised eye of shame so that the judge was moved. And in this way, Jesus' parable reminds us and reminds his readers, his first listeners, of the early Hebrew Scripture parables of other widows like Ruth or Tamar. So now we come to the so what question in the sermon, right? So what does this mean for me? In a time like this, in a world worn out by cynicism, why take a stand with my neighbor? Why care for those at the margin of society? Why care for the poor? Do we do this because Jesus told us to? Do we do this because we get to feel righteous and virtuous and pat ourselves on the back? Why do we do this? Why does Jesus say that it is the good news to stand with the poor? When I've been hurt and vulnerable, I don't want to be the object of someone's pity. Do you? Right? I don't want to be somebody's project for their spiritual merit badge. And why should I expect someone that I'm called to help to want that from me? So why does Jesus say the good news is to stand with those at the margins? Mother Teresa said that the world is in the shape it's in because we've forgotten one simple thing. We've forgotten that we belong to each other. And when we belong to one another, all over, we're kin. One way to catch a funny look at a cocktail party is to say, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a healthcare chaplain. People kind of go, oh, that sounds like fun. It's actually so wonderfully meaningful to be with people at all points in life and to listen, and in the words of one of my colleagues, to overhear how the gospel begins to make sense in someone's life at that day. And the cool part of that is that it changes them maybe, but it really changes how I see things. And that where you stand changes everything about what you see. Have you ever heard of this sort of outlandish, wonderful Jesuit pastor, Father Greg Boyle? So if you haven't, I encourage you to go look him up on YouTube. So Father Greg Boyle, early in his ministry, was called to one of the poorest parishes in Los Angeles. And it was an area 30 years ago, like it is now, overridden with gang violence. And Father Boyle found himself having funeral after funeral of people under the age of 25 who had died of gun violence. And so he founded what has become known as Homeboy Industries. And he founded it on the idea that those who are working together have pride in their work and love for one another. And so it started as a bakery, right? And the deal was he put rival members of gangs working together, right, to bake the bread and find a way out of gang life. It's become one of the most successful reentry programs or out-of-gang life programs in the world. And I'm grateful to Father Boyle for lots of things, but mostly for the way he talks about the gospel news. He again quotes Mother Teresa saying, Mother Teresa. Wonder what my wife would say about that Freudian slip. He again quotes Mother Teresa saying, we're not called to be successful. We're called to be faithful. So part of my job at IU Health is not just to work with the spiritual care department, with the chaplains, which is wonderful, but a new part of this job is to work with congregations to address social determinants of health, those parts of our world that make health care work out well. So I won't belabor this for long, but is that a familiar term to you, social determinants of health? No, not so much. Well, it boils down to this. 20% of good health outcomes depends on having access to a great medical care system like Eskenazi or Community or IU Health or any of the other great medical systems we're blessed to have in Indiana. About another 30% of good health outcomes depends, and this makes a lot of sense, with how we treat ourselves, what we eat, drink, smoke, don't smoke, run, how well we treat ourselves. But about 50% of health outcomes depends at some level or another on where you live. There was a study here in Indiana that showed if you live at the north end of the Monon Trail, you're going to live statistically about 8 years longer than if you live at the south end. If you live in an impoverished neighborhood without access to good food, where there's gun violence and you feel frightened all the time, where there's not as much access to good education or a good position, that impacts your health in very real ways. And so health systems have long ago figured out if we can partner with the community to change what's happening upstream, that's going to make all the difference in the world downstream. So part of my job is writing grants to help support this kind of work, right? So I write a lot of grants. And do you know what grant funders like? And this is getting back to Father Boyle. They like success stories. They like to hear that everything's worked out well, and I've got the metrics to show you how well everything's worked out. And I love Father Boyle because he kind of says, what about Mario? What about Mario, with whom I worked, who was in gang violence all his life and got out of the gangs for 2 months and found his way to light and salvation and faith, only to find himself back in gang life and lose his life? Now, that's not a success story according to the grant funders. But Father Boyle says, according to the gospel, that nobody can take those 2 months away from Mario or his family or the people who loved him. Right? So, the gospel does not ask us to stand with the marginalized to be successful on their behalf or on our behalf, but because where we stand changes us and changes them. Father Boyle says, he quotes his teacher, Sister Elaine, the founder of my mother house in New York, was asked, "How do you work with the poor?" She answered, "You don't. You don't work with the poor. You share your life with the poor. It's as basic as crying together. It's about casting your lot with them rather than changing their lot, because it changes you." Jesus asks, "Where are you standing?" And after defeats and losses, Jesus asks again, "Are you still standing there?" We belong to one another. And because we belong to one another, we stand with one another. And here's the thing: where we stand and when we stand with and for one another, when we stand at the margins, what we see changes. And guess what? We see hope and joy where others may see what's cynical and lost. We see the capacity to cry with our brothers and sisters when they cry, to rejoice when they rejoice. We are reminded of the delight and wonder of a shared world where we are all kin together. Amen and amen.